what is your favorite fun fact about a bat?
Ooh, these are tough. Okay. Bat migration is a relatively rare phenomenon that we think only 1 to 2% of all bat species do some form of long distance migration. I think bat migration is really poorly understood because we just don't have the tools to really follow the bats and know where they go. So it makes bat migration kind of this black box to us. We know it's happening, but we don't really know the specifics. So common noctules are, as the name implies, a common species across Europe. And they're also known to migrate, and so there's a lot of information already about their some of their patterns from this mark recapture or from other previous studies from our group. So it was kind of an ideal species to work with to try to understand migration. Previous work looking at the migration of these noctule bats used radiotelemetry, and this was putting a VHF tag that sends a beacon at a specific frequency from the animal and trying to follow those animals over time. And luckily our director, Martin Wokelski, can fly a plane, and so he would go out and kind of scour the landscape in the direction we assume the bats were migrating the next day. And so we could actually get some long distance tracks over 1 or 2 days of migration. But doing this radio tracking by plane process is still very time consuming, and you can only really follow 1 to 2 individuals at a time. So it was revolutionary at the time, but still very limited in how we could understand bat migration. And so we were very fortunate in that we had Sigfox Internet of Things technology, and it could be a very small device, but also send data over quite large distances across mostly the entire continent of Europe. We know that they hibernate in the region near the Institute, and we were able to then take advantage of that by having known hibernacula that we could visit during the spring and find bats as they were preparing to leave for their spring migration. We were able also to kind of space out the timings of tagging to try to understand the full span of the migration period. Over the past 3 years, we tagged 125 individuals. Of the 125 individuals that we tagged, we had 71 that showed this migration. The data was immediately overwhelming. We saw bats traveling hundreds of kilometers in a single night, and so it kind of looked like this explosion of activity outside of where we were tagging them, spreading all across Central Europe. So we were kind of surprised that there wasn't this main corridor that bats were taking as they were migrating. Instead, they really seem to go in quite a variety of directions as they're leaving. Even on the same night, we'll have bats kind of going in completely opposite directions. Additionally, we wanted to understand the larger weather components during migration. And so we explored kind of what weather predicts what night will be a migration. And we found that we have these low pressure fronts of warm air that's moving across the landscape in the spring, bringing a lot of rain soon after it. But bats seem to be able to actually surf this wave of warm air, kind of moving ahead of it and getting this push from the wind as they're migrating. And so you see this explosion of migration on these nights before a storm that's moving through. And sometimes the bats are able to capture that wave of wind for a second night, but often sort of the storm passes over them during the day and they have to wait and for the next good conditions to migrate again. I think this information is very useful for conservationists. We're now starting to get a better idea of what migration looks like. And one of the main things that we can say is there is no obvious corridor. So if you want to try to mitigate bat mortalities, you can't just say, don't build in this region. Bat migration is happening at a continental scale all over the place. But at the same time, our tracking is limited in its resolution in space and time. And so we can't necessarily say when bats are flying near wind turbines, or if they're flying at the right altitude to be influenced by these wind turbines. But we're starting to get a better understanding of just what are the conditions that bats migrate under. So potentially we could have better predictions of what are risky nights just for having lots of bats out and migrating, and then use that to update our mitigation strategies. But I would be cautious to say that, because we see a track of a bat moving through a specific area, that we know that that's now a dangerous place to put a wind turbine. We don't necessarily know the full relationship between these migrations and the conservation threats. What's next? We are currently collaborating with researchers all across Europe to expand this network of migration. We want to understand how the bats are migrating in different locations as well as different seasons. We can then start to get a much larger continental view or species level view of how do these migrations occur and what are the different impacts that these different locations could have. I mean, there's a few bat species that eat birds. There's bats that eat frogs. There's, I mean, I did my PhD work on a bat that eats fish in the ocean, and it can drink salt water. So I like to call it a marine mammal.